I'm Himanshu Roy. I teach in Delhi University. Presently, I am Atal Bihari Bajpayee Senior Fellow in Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, Teen Murti House in New Delhi. I'll be speaking in this lecture on the characteristics of Indic thought. And if we look into the history of Indic thought, there are broadly 6 characteristics that in the given next 30-35 minutes I'll be speaking on are the 6 major characteristics on Indian political thought. Let me begin with the Indian state or the nature of Indian state, that will be more appropriate to say. We have in the written for the first time about the Indian state beginning with Digh Nikaya, which is called Agan Sutta Hissa, in which for the first time we find that Buddha is discussing about the emergence and formation of the Indian state, which is a contract that a smaller society, a village society or a tribal society comes together and consensually elects a person. He may be a monarch, he may be a leader, he may be a tribal head, who will be given 1/6 of the share of the rice or paddy for his services to protect the community from the theft. The Marxists have argued that this signifies the emergence of the private property and estate, because they link the emergence of the state with the private property. But here we find that there is nothing like emergence of the private property. The only is that the theft has increased, there is some degree of social insecurity, and therefore the people come together and then they agree with mutual agreement to elect a person who can better serve the society, that community, that may be a tribal community, that may be a village community. So for the first time, we find that Buddha is talking about the emergence of a state. But before that, in our historical traditions, in our cultural traditions, we find about the Rig Veda, in which in the Mandalam, that is in the chapter 10th of Rig Veda, we find the elementary form of emergence of a state. The next stage is of Ramayana, where we find roughly 4 elements of the state. Then we find Mahabharata, where we find the 5 elements of the state, and its most developed form in ancient India, we find all the 7 elements of the state in Kautil's Arthashastra. So this is about the emergence of a state in India, in Indic traditions, culturally and materially. But let me clarify here one thing, that Buddhism itself, Buddhism means the written document I mean here, was compiled, what Buddha said was compiled approximately 75 to 100 years after his death. As Islam or the Quran was compilation of what Prophet had said after his death. Prophet himself never wrote. Buddha himself never wrote. Christ himself never wrote. Their teachings were compiled after their death, and these were compiled 75 to 100 years after his death. We do not know when it was compiled. So again, these are the different interpretations of different people about a person who seems to be teaching to the society, propagating a view for social justice, emancipation, for a libertarian society. But again, the book, the holy books are compilation after their deaths, and these are different interpretations of different people because these are compilations. So let's keep it in mind, this aspect of the emergence of Indian state, particularly in terms of Buddha's writing. The cultural traditions that we have about Ramayana and Mahabharata, and subsequently in its best form in the most developed form was Kautil's Arthashastra. So this is how it begins at different characteristics. But one thing is definite, that these are the storehouse of knowledge and shows how the Indic traditions have been rich. We don't have a historical trajectory of Ramayana and Mahabharata. We cannot say with determinant that at what time and who wrote it. We know, of course, Valmiki, it's a part of the cultural traditions, but we do not know yet when it was written. We don't have a written thing. It was a compilation subsequently, generation after generations. For example, in comparison to Ramayana and Mahabharata or Buddhism, Kabir wrote in around 14th, 15th century, 15th century or 16th century. He never wrote himself. His sayings, his Vani were compiled, and that too in two different traditions. One in the Western traditions, that is in Rajasthan, and in Punjab. Guru Granth Sahib we find, and then in the Eastern traditions, that is in Banaras, what we call Bijak. So again, what we understand as Kabir Vanis or sayings are basically compilations after his death. So we do not know exactly, and this is one of the serious problems of Indic traditions, that we do not know who has written and when it was written. So most of the writings, and as I said earlier, that 98% of the manuscripts have yet to be translated. So we do not know, we don't have a much of knowledge which is a storehouse of Indic history. So what we have as a part of Indic history is not a determinate thing. A substantive history is known to us either through the material findings, etc., excavations, and then in the medieval period when political Islam comes, we find the arrival of the paper and the writing is there. So we have a Babarnama, we have a Akbarnama, and series of writings. We can say that these are the writings of the ruling elite. It's not the writing of the subaltern. It's not a subaltern historiography. It's the writing of the ruling elite. And therefore, accordingly, we have been interpreting the history. Yes, one definite history is written by, you can say, Tulsidas, because Tulsidas manuscript is still available. Tulsidas manuscript Ramcharitmanas is the second manuscript. The original was lost, it was burnt. What we have is the second writing on Ramcharitmanas by Tulsidas. So just to share some trivia informations that how the Indian state has been evolving. Now let me come to the features. One, of course, very important, very contemporary, very topical and relevant is about secularism. Indian state has been by and large secular because Indian society has been secular, and Indian state has been broadly reflecting the Indian society, its cultural elements. In most of the saint poets' writings, if we look at the history of or historiography of the saint poets' Vanis, starting from Tiruvalluvar to Kabir to subsequently Shankar Dev, across different regions of India, we find there is never a challenge, there is never a rebellion, there is never a revolution against the Indian state. We had a series of revolutions in European history, But we don't find a series of revolutions in Indian history. This is something very unique. This is something how the social sciences and the Indic tools should be used to interpret Indic history. What we had through the saint poets who reflected the popular will and a protest was peaceful, democratic, and suggestions to the ruling elite to improve governance. So the focus was on governance, better governance, co-opting the others. Let's it be inclusive. And therefore we find that these saint poets are still 500 years or 600 years or 2000 years even after their death. They have been very popular because they have been inclusive. They have challenged the society, their norms, but in a very democratic way, in a very peaceful way. It has not been a violent society, because Indic society has always been a major part of it, if not completely the 100% mobile. And there has been a wide opportunity for upward social and individual mobility. So one aspect of therefore Indian secularism is this, that the Indian state and the Indian society has been thoroughly secular. Secular means we have been celebrating the diversities. It's not a question of tolerance, tolerating someone. No, we have been co-opting the others. We have been open to ideas. We have been always supporting religions, treating every religion as equal, giving opportunities for their individual and social mobility. The state has been broadly across the entire historical trajectory of civilizations, broadly secular. This is one unique feature that we find part of the Indic traditions. The second part is that here in India there has always been one sovereign secular power, unlike Europe where there has been a conflict between the Pope and the monarch. There has always been dual sovereignty, and there has been conflict of sovereignty between the two centers of power, the Catholic Church and the sovereigns, the secular sovereigns. Unlike Europe, we in India have always been, the ruling monarch has always been one. The power has rested with the ruling monarch always. There has been no parallel second center of power. This is something very interesting. The third part has been, and the special characteristics of Indic society has been, we had always a civil society. Imagine a medieval Europe. Let me put it time and again a comparison with European society so that we can better understand and appreciate our Indic traditions and Indian society. Civil society in Europe emerges after the emergence of capitalism, emergence of industrialization, emergence of modern democracy. Civil society has been existing in even pre-colonial India. It's not a gift of capitalism in a modern society. In India, it has been existing. The saint poets have been critical of patriarchy. The saint poets have been critical of the Indian monarchs, the Indian states. We had a long traditions of monarchy. Even in Ramayana, we find a series of monarchies. In Mahabharata, we find a series of monarchies. And one of the major civilizations where monarchies have ruled for more than 2500 years or even 3000 years, because still we have not been able to decipher the Indus civilization. So we do not know. The written history has been around approximately 2500 years or 3000 years in terms of material civilizations and its documentations. So such a long history of monarchical period. If we compare it with a Greek civilizations, the elite, despite having a slave society, the elite had a traditions of elections. The magistrates were elected in Greek society. We in India had not such kind of traditions, but yes, at the grassroots in the villages, in the temples, we find the committees. If you go into the temples, we find a sense of history. We find committees collectively working together. So at one pole, we find the monarchs and the history of their monarchies. Simultaneously, at the other pole, at the subaltern bottom level, at the grassroots level, we find the collective, the committees and the civil society vibrantly functioning. This is something very interesting and contradictory. The next characteristics of Indian traditions have been that we have been having the property rights. It's a very academic and something unconventional that the debate comes from the colonial type, because in Europe, the eldest son inherited the property. And let me tell you some very interesting facts. The Jews had no rights to own the land in medieval Europe. We never resisted or blocked such kind of segment of society in Indian civilizations. Jews had only the rights for the trade and commerce, because that was not the major source of earning. And therefore, Shakespeare, Shylock is a Jew. In Indian civilizations, we find even the Parsis are being co-opted, given the opportunity, given the protection. Look at the contradictions. And still we have been using the European tools of interpretations in social sciences for decades, even after independence, and interpreting our history from their tools. So this individual freedom, this kind of freedom of civil society, this kind of diversity, this kind of celebrations have been part of the Indic traditions. And the best comparison has been given by Ambedkar. If I remember correctly, volume 5 of the collected works, there he makes a comparison between the European slave society from the Roman Greek and the Indian, the so-called Dalits. The slaves were commodity to be purchased and sold. They had no family rights. They had no homes of their own. The Indian lowest order, even the worst kind of poor, which the colonial poverty, which created after its rule. We have a family of the Dalits. They have their own homes. They have their own animals. They have their own gods. They have their own property, including the lands. Before the British came, this kind of the poverty which was visible after the colonial rule was absent. Of course, there was a wide gap, even as per the colonial travelers and as per their memoirs and the notings, that there was a wide gap between the rich and the poor in India, which they said that was not so much in European societies. But everyone is amazed or was amazed to see so much of vertical and the horizontal mobility among the different sections of the Indian society. Intercaste marriages included into it. So this kind of freedom, individual liberty has been an important component for civilizations, which was absent for the serf in medieval history in Europe, which was absent for the slaves. And remember, this serf and the slaves who brought in series of revolutions in Europe constituted of roughly 75 to 80% of the populations. Here the Dalit, this is the new modern word which emerged from 1970s in popular vogue. The first time we find the use of the word Dalit, the Sanskrit word, is in 1929-30s in the Marathi newspaper. This Dalit is a hardly 15% of the population. If we take the modern census of their population at the pan-Indic level, from Jammu and Kashmir to Kanyakumari and from Somnath, Gujarat to Kamakhya, Assam, we find that hardly 15% of the population are Dalit. Just in contrast, the slave society in Europe was roughly 75 to 80%. At the peak of the Greco-Roman civilizations, and I am citing Engels' book, The Origin of the Family, Private Property and Estate, where Engels says that at the peak of the Greco-Roman civilizations, on one citizen, which means free individual, there are 18 slaves on an average. Imagine the society, how much polarized it was. 18 slaves per citizen at the peak of their civilizations. Here in India, on the just contrary, we find hardly a 15% of the Dalit population. I am saying all these things about the characteristics of Indian political thought or Indic part of the Indic civilizations and Indic history, because the contemporary academia in India or the modern academia in India is following basically the colonial construction of Indian history, which needs a course correction, and therefore this is very important. The other aspect was about the economy, the village economy, a self-sustaining, self-contained village economy which was propagated to us. This is not a fact. The fact is that roughly 25% of the economy to 30% of the economy, as the modern economists have interpreted, that was monetized before the British took over the power. As very recently, one of the economists have argued that roughly in 135 years, 40 years till 1935, roughly 45 trillion of India's wealth were looted by the British East India Company. Imagine a situation where 45 trillion of India's wealth was looted by, and as I said, that 100 boats in one single day from Murshidabad Palace after 1757, Battle of Plassey, was carted away from Hooghly, Murshidabad, through Hooghly on the boat to Calcutta, and later to be shipped and transported to London. So the loot basically, which entered into the British lexicography from the British East India Company rule, one of the earlier Indian words the loot entered into was because of this. So it's they who destroyed our economy, and that led to the stagnation and fridge of the society, made the society more rural, made the society stagnant and castists. The earlier society before the British took over was much more mobile, and therefore the rural society, the village society was not so autarkic, a word which has been very popular in the 60s and 70s and during the colonial times. The villages were mobile, but definitely in comparison to the coastal centers where there were a lot of trade and commerce, or in the urban centers, we find that the villages in India before the British came was much more skilled, provided opportunity to those who were willing to be mobile, and therefore it was not autarkic as a very fixed kind of notion created by the British, the colonial society and the colonial state, perpetuated and propagated about the Indian society. Other aspect is this, that the what kind of ideal polity Indian society should have. We have had, as I said earlier, that the focus was on governance, but equally the focus was on social justice. Time and again, the saint poets, the representatives of the people, the rebels of the time, they have been requesting, they have been mobilizing, they have been challenging the ruling elite, the different monarchies, regional or pan-Indian, to focus on the social justice as well, so that those who are on the margins are co-opted into the mainstream. And therefore, we find that one of the important planks of ideal social polity was to lesser the social gap as well as the economic gap, which equally means the focus on taxation. Ramcharitmanas and other writings of Tulsi focuses equally on the ideal polity, the kind of Ramraj that Ramcharitmanas creates. That's a reflective of the kind of ideal polities that Shankar Dev creates, the kind of ideal polity that Kabir creates is a reflective of the aspirations of the society of the medieval time as well as in ancient India. So, fighting against caste equality, gender equality, then social equality, providing opportunity to everyone, co-opting the different castes into the mainstream, as I repeat once again, was the part of the idealism to be developed among the Indian society, and the monarchs must take care of this idealism. So, we find that another important characteristics of Indian society is this part of social justice, and all these concepts were wrapped around dharma. Dharma, and I will end up with this, that dharma doesn't mean the kind of interpretations with religion or equating with religion. Religare, partly yes, because religion is an entirely different converted meaning of religare, or a rather distorted meaning. If at all there is some similarities between dharma, it's with religare. And dharma here means equality, giving opportunity to everyone for a better social life. It means different people have interpreted it differently, including Tagore, and it means a bundle of woods with a strength. It means the collective, the focus is on the collective. Let me read it out, this definition of dharma. Sustain, the dharma means to uphold in Tagore's way, in Tagore's definition, to uphold, to sustain and to uplift. This is the role model which reflects of the Indian society, and polity of course must reflect it. Equally important in this, the method that was to be used, as I had said earlier, the governance. The focus is a transparent, which is reflected in Arthashastra of Kautil. The focus is on transparency. The focus is to check corruption, and for that there are different methodology, there are different departments. And the third is the state or the monarch must involve the collective, the subalterns, the villagers, the people, the subjects. Yes, we had the citizenship earlier, we became the subjects under the monarchy, we had no voting rights, definitely it's a fact, but it's equally important that we in Indian civilization focused on democracy focused on collective subaltern participation in the social affairs of the village life and in the urban affairs. Thank you very much.